Hello, I'm Henry Cullen and I'm a teacher at Albans High School for Girls. This video is an introduction to how Eduqas does the literature component of its exam and talking about its paper design and the impact that has upon our teaching and some things we perhaps need to consider as we're going about delivering the literature component. Now, it's primarily probably aimed at those who are either new to Educas or maybe considering switching from OCR to Educas. But nevertheless, if you have been already teaching with the Educas course for a few years, I hope you'll find things in here which are either useful or even with which you might disagree, and you can then join in with the panel and we can have a discussion then. So certainly my views are not the exam board views. I do not represent Educas nor OCR for that matter. And these are just my opinions gleaned from a few years of teaching the Educas course. So I hope this is useful and we'll cover, as you can see there on the left, things that are distinctively Educas versus OCR. We'll look at a few of the question styles from 2018 and 19. We will touch on the fact that there is a bigger language gap from the Latin language work of the Educas course to the set texts than there might be perhaps with the OCR. We'll think about the essay because that's quite a big chunk of the Educas papers, a bigger chunk than with the OCR papers. And finally, I'll whiz through some fantastic resources which you may or may not be aware of. I'm going to hide the floating view of my face so I don't have to stare at it for the next 25 minutes or so. And then we'll get going. So as you may well know, roughly 3,000 people entered for the Educas GCSE in its first year, 2018. I don't actually have the stat for 2019. I believe it was around the same, if not a little bit higher. Quite interestingly, of those 3,000, 2/3 did for paper 3B, which is the history or culture paper. They did that rather than the second set text, which was paper 3A. So most of the Educas students actually did one set text, namely the thematic paper, paper 2, and then did the background paper, paper 3, with about 1,000 doing two set texts. That background paper, paper 2, looks like this. It's based around a theme, and that's a crucial difference from OCR, which is mainly aimed at particular authors, sometimes a selection of authors, but mainly specific authors. The theme paper is worth 30% of the overall marks. Around 130 lines of Latin to be read, and the current options, the current selections are either Travels by Land and Sea or Superstition and Magic, which my hunch is that it's probably a little bit more popular, I think, than the Travels by Land and Sea. Each of these selections has about 6 or 7 different extracts and authors and indeed genres, and that's really important to note because the theme manifests itself differently with different genre. They each have the same prose and verse split, slightly more prose lines than verse lines. That's not always the case with the paper 2. For example, when it was in its first years, I believe the youth and education paper had slightly more prose versus the day at the races, which had slightly more verse. But this time, both options have the same split. So that isn't really a factor in working out which option to choose. Of course, there is the big feature of the visual sources, and alongside studying the text, you also need to study 6 pictures, not in ridiculous detail, but the students need to be able to answer questions on the key points of them in the exam and link them crucially to the text they're reading. And the exam board do specify certain bullet points of factual aspects or background content, which is connected with the theme. So, for example, what an augur does or what a haruspex does for the superstition and magic paper. The exam comprises 60 marks or is worth 60 marks in 75 minutes. Candidates have to work pretty steadily through it. Mind you, there are lots of short questions which they can work through pretty quickly and then have a good chunk of time dedicated to the essay at the end, which is worth, as you can see there, 16 marks. Is quite a substantial amount. It's 25 or over 25% of the paper. Now that is a bigger chunk of marks than with OCR. The crucial difference with the Educas literature is that the candidates get a resource booklet in the exam, which provides the text and indeed the vocab. The vocab is not underneath the text or parallel to it. It's listed alphabetically at the back of the full text. So it's not quite at sort of ready access. Paper 3 is the remaining part of the course, the 20% left of the marks. It's a narrative paper, so it's about 80 lines to be read of a single narrative with English sections intervening. You often have, say, 5 or 6 chunks of Latin with the intervening English, and this is the actual text, the translation of the actual text, rather than just a paraphrase. Now that's important because there are actually exam questions asked on that English, so that needs to be treated seriously and studied quite carefully too. The current selections are either Tacitus' account of Boudica or Ovid's story of Alcyone and Ceyx. Now the exam, 60 minutes this time and only 40 marks. Again, the text and vocab is provided. And again, there's a substantial amount of marks for the essay. So here it's 12 marks, and that is 30% of the overall paper. So again, the essay is a considerable chunk and bigger than in any OCR paper. Now, the yellow bits on this page are the things that are, I think, distinctive from OCR. So you've got, for example, in the theme paper, the fact that you will almost always have a range of different extracts and authors, 6 or 7, that's quite a lot of different genre and authors to cover. It might be that you don't always go into too much detail about who these different authors were and the context of each bit of set text, beyond the absolute key for giving the students a sense of why they're writing and what they're writing about. The prose and verse split, well, that's something that you never actually encounter, is it, in a GCSE OCR literature paper, because you choose either prose lit or verse lit, and up to 2 of those. So this paper, the thematic paper, does actually, of course, incorporate a bit of both. So students will encounter some prose and some verse. The visual sources, of course, is distinctively Educas, as is the fact that they need to be aware of the background. And then in the exam, the text and vocab being provided and the bigger essays. With the paper 3, the English translation appearing in the set text is something that doesn't appear in the OCR. So it's a slightly different skill or a different focus required there. Now, what's the impact of all this on our teaching? That's the crucial question. We'll come to that in just a tick. The visual sources, as you may well have seen, are presented really elegantly in the Educas materials online. You have about 3 bullet points there of context, contextual information which students need to be aware of. For example, with superstition and magic here, work of an augur, work of haruspex, what do curse tablets look like, what's their function. All of that is readily available in various stages of the CLC, for example, book 3 in this instance. And doesn't require huge amounts of student research or student time, but they just need to be aware of the key facts about it. That said, it makes a really nice first homework for students to be able to dive into the topic, do some research about the bullet points, maybe with some guided questions from yourself, and then link them to a couple of, for example, the pictures. There are 6 pictures generally for the Educas paper 2. You have a caption given to you in the study booklet, but that won't be provided in the exam. And the students don't need to know every single fact about what's going on in every single picture, but they need to be able to know the key details of each. It says explicitly, actually, in the Educas teacher sort of guidance, do not spend overly long working through these pictures. They're supposed to occupy a small amount of the overall course time. But that said, they are potentially a really lovely starting point if you want to work them into a research homework, or B, there's something that are really lovely to drip feed along with your reading. As, for example, you read a particular extract that relates to one of these pictures in particular, they're fantastic to study alongside. They are really good for encouraging students to be critical viewers as well as critical readers, and they're excellent for synoptic thinking about linking the text to their historical and visual, indeed, background. So there are 6 for each of those. Now, thinking about what these Educas features mean for our teaching, well, the fact that it's an open book exam means that I think you need to practice that skill of scanning through the texts, the Latin texts, I mean, which are all there printed, because the questions will refer to specific lines of specific texts. Students don't have to unlike with OCR, like spot the passage and remember exactly which bit of which poem or which bit of prose this is. There's less need for student panic in the exam and trying to work out, is this a bit from early on or a bit from later on? And that's something that often unsettles students, but there's less of a need for that with Educas because they can always find the passage and locate it within the rest of the context. The fact that the vocab is there in the exam means that actually it's probably worth practicing at times, looking to check that vocab and to remember to get that word, not the word above it, not the word below it, and also to check things like, is there anything interesting about this word? E.g., does it only appear in the plural, or is it a word which is, say, a first declension but masculine word, or a second declension feminine word, for example? Does it have a strange perfect tense? Is it a defective verb, for example? Using that vocab is something to practice and to work in when you are doing perhaps assessments. There's less of a need to get students to memorize an exact translation and then to be able to trot it out. There are no marks in the exam. Well, there's no 5-mark translation question in the exam. So there's less of a need for sort of parrot fashion recall. Some of the exam questions will require students to look at specific words, and they'll say which Latin word tells us that ... So students do need to have a sort of knowledge of the text at word level detail. That's still absolutely key, and of course it's going to be key for style questions too. But I think the fact that there's a vocab list there is a useful safety net, and should reassure teachers in that you don't have to absolutely drill that text and have a off by heart translation learnt at every single line, because things can be checked if a student forgets a particular word. I think that's a fairly enlightened way to be doing the GCSE examining. It's less of a tyranny of memory, if you like. The fact that you've got the visual sources there mean that there is, as I said, a great scope for maybe a little initial project to kick off the study of the set text. Might you alternatively interweave the study of those pictures with the text, and the key thing is practicing the linking of the photos to the text. So when you're reading the text, do ask students, can we link this to a photograph we've studied, or maybe 2 or 3? Are there some photographs that are particularly relevant? And that is going to be very, very, very useful for essay technique. There is, I suppose, an overlap with, if you're doing the background paper 3B, the sort of visual crit skills that you're developing as you're looking at sources there. So that makes a happy overlap. The thematic approach means that there is more focus, I think, this is for paper 2, on the essay, and then the essay structure and practice, of course, become really important. And students need to be comfortable and flexible at talking across the selection. And we'll talk about this more in a sec, selecting the very best examples for their essays, rather than ones which they know well, but actually aren't really geared at the question. Finally, in paper 3, the fact that you have English sections printed and indeed examined, which, as we shall see in a sec, means that there is a need or a chance to practice questions about that English, including why or how or what do you feel is going on here. Students need to reflect on those lines of literature, almost like their English lit type lessons, as well as, of course, reflecting carefully on the Latin too. So there are quite a few considerations, I think, for our teaching there and for the student experience. And we'll look in a sec now at some of the questions asked in the exam to see that there are a few different nuances in the Educas exam question styles. So I've taken all the paper 2 questions here from 2018, both options, Day at the Races and Youth and Education. As you can see, for both, there's lots of marks just for knowing the text really well and knowing the content really well, including regarding those pictures. And this should be quite reassuring. Of the 60 marks, students will do really well and be able to get sort of 40 marks plus, I think, for just knowing that content really well and answering in sensible ways about it. The questions I've highlighted yellow here, I think, call for a bit of personal reflection and aren't necessarily as obvious and as easy as they might at first appear. For example, how do these words suggest? Well, that's asking students to reflect on the function of words and the impact of particular words. It's not a style question here, but it's more like a reflection question. What's the point of the author saying this now, and why is it quite powerful? Likewise, that question, explain in which something is an effective piece of writing. Well, the word effective there is quite vague. Students need to think about what the author is trying to convey and whether or not they've been successful in doing it. Again, this is not entirely a style question. It's more of a personal reflection of the impact of particular sentences and clauses and thinking about what the author's aim is at any one point. Likewise, in the yellow questions I've highlighted down below, what do you think he means by this? Well, that's a comprehension question, but it's one where it's really testing whether the students have thought about what they're reading, the purpose of each sentence, for example, within the context of a paragraph. The style questions in the paper 2 are generally worth 6 marks at a maximum, and they're typical style questions that I'm sure you've seen with OCR a lot already. So they are nothing new with them. If, for example, you were aiming at 6 marks, and it might specify 3 examples, 1 point or 1 example would equal citing some Latin, translating it. I think is always a safe idea in English, and then discussing it thoroughly. So all of that, Latin plus English plus explanation, would equal 1 point, and so three lots of that for 6 marks. The essay questions, as you can see, start with a statement, generally, often quite provocative, often easy to disagree with, and then ask you how far you agree, or in fact, in the Day at the Races example, how far would a Roman have agreed? So that's quite different, isn't it? It's putting yourself in the shoes of views then versus views now. And these questions, as we will discuss later on, do, I think, invite argument for and against, and then they expect you to have some sort of conclusion at the end. As I said, 16 marks, quite a big chunk of the marks for the paper. These are the paper 3 questions for 2019. So the overall exam here is worth 40 marks. Again, some marks simply for content, between 12 and 14 there for both options. The questions I've highlighted in green are again these which do require personal reflection. Why do you think Tacitus gives us this information? It's only worth a mark, but it does require you to think about the purpose of writing it at a particular stage of the narrative. Alternatively, how effectively do you think Tacitus conveys? Well, this invites personal response. You might think actually Tacitus doesn't convey the atmosphere brilliantly, or he does, but what is his aim there? And therefore talk to that in your answer. He achieves this, that, and the other. Again, looking further down the page, talking about the effectiveness of a comparison requires students to think about what an author's intention is, or how do you think readers might react? Is about, again, reacting to literature in a fairly personal way. And students should feel quite emboldened there to state what they think, as long as it's based on the literature. Now, in yellow, I've highlighted the fact that a couple of these questions explicitly ask about the English section. So there, it's almost like an English lit skill, reading a paragraph, thinking about evocation of characterization, tone, mood, all of that in the same way as you would do in an English lesson. The style question for the paper 3 tends to be 8 marks, but you'll see that in it does actually allow you to talk about content as well as features such as the choice and arrangement of Latin words. So it's not entirely marks for style, and in fact, in knowing that text well will give you some marks anyway. But probably a blend of content and style would be recommended there. The essay, again, gives you a statement, which it's quite easy to argue for and against, and 12 marks out of 40. So worth practicing a lot in class, and also worth spending students ensuring they've got enough time for in the exam to answer thoroughly. Now, with the Educas, we do have to be aware of the language gap, a little bit more probably than with the OCR. Now, by the language gap, I mean the gap between the level of the language that they're doing in class for the language side and then the actual literature. Now, all of these things do not appear in the Educas language prescription versus the OCR one, and they may well appear in the real unadapted Latin of the set texts. So a range of passives, not just third person. Semi-dependent verbs, audeo, gaudio, solio, for example. Some key pronouns or pronominal adjectives, ipse, quidam, idem, for example. They're very, very common, of course, in real Latin. And they have not technically been met maybe in the Educas course. Future participles, range of infinitives in the indirect statement, and then probably the most important obvious omission from the Educas language requirement, the ablative absolute, which of course is very common in real Latin, and actually quite easy to do as an extension beyond the curriculum, because it's a really lovely practice of A, the ablative, B, of participles. And it's of course a very useful way to provide context at the start of a sentence, but not in the Educas language spec. Nor are gerundives and nor are connecting relatives. So all of those you need to be mindful of when you're reading the set texts, because students doing the Educas, maybe in year 10, maybe in year 11, won't necessarily have covered them, or if they've seen them, they won't necessarily have learnt them and feel comfortable on them. Now, of course, whether or not you're doing OCR or Educas, there are some things you're going to encounter in GCSE literature which go way beyond the level of the language anyway. And they might include, for example, present and perfect subjunctives, verbs of fearing, gerunds, more subtle ways to introduce constructions. By that I mean, for example, like Caesar sent a letter, : the army should retreat. Now, of course, that is really an indirect command, but there's no verb of ordering there. And that is sometimes tricky to get into the idiom of these constructions without the signpost words. The two things at the bottom in yellow, I think, are the actual reasons why set texts are often hard and seen as really hard. They, of course, are going to include simply longer sentences with more subordinate clauses, often not necessarily at a level of the grammar that's beyond the students, but when you put multiple ones of these together, that does immediately create a bit of a puzzle and often quite intimidating. So breaking down long sentences and reassuring that the students can actually achieve that level, even if they haven't quite met anything of such length. And secondly, slightly more casual use of cases. There might be uses of the genitive, dative, ablative, which you haven't encountered in class. And it's sometimes hard to explain exactly what is going on if students have learnt simplistic rules about those cases. So just to illustrate this, here's a paragraph from the Pliny selection in the Magic and Superstition. And all of the things I'm about to highlight in green are things that go beyond the Educas language syllabus. So you can see there's quite a bit. Range of infinitives, idem, a gerund, in the second paragraph, a perfect subjunctive, there's a present passive infinitive, for example. And in line 10, for example, a connecting relative. So a fair bit. So be mindful of that as you're reading the text. There is a bigger leap with the Educas than with the OCR, assuming that you haven't gone way beyond the Educas specification, which you may well have done anyway. Students, I think, would benefit from some explanation of what these forms are. I don't think you've probably got time to dwell too much on exactly the grammar behind all of them, but explaining that they're not just arbitrary spellings, but they are logical and should be there, I think is probably actually quite a good, reassuring and fairly honest approach, which probably demystifies. Now let's think about the essays, because I've said they are quite a big chunk of the exam. I think it's important to show the students the marking grid which is used, and to actually do a sort of marking exercise in class. In terms of extra titles, more titles for these new selection of texts, the 2021 additional assessment materials released to help you get towards teacher assessed grades, they did contain 2 essay titles for each of the paper 2 options, and indeed they contain 2 for the old selection for paper 3. So you can again see the style of likely exam questions. The top band, getting into that top band on the marking grids, is pretty tricky. It's ambitious, and for AO1, which is basically knowledge of the text, it talks about thorough knowledge, examples that are extensive, well selected, and fully integrated. And for AO2, which is the analysis or the discussion assessment objective, it talks about making a convincing interpretation or being perceptive, and that's quite hard for a 15, 16-year-old. So when studying set text, I'm not sure that I would be always perceptive about set text all the time. Imaginative, ditto, and then draws conclusions. Now, all of these, I think, are things we can practice, and I've put on the right-hand side there a selection of activities which may well be geared towards practicing these skills. So for the AO1, short factual tests, flashcards, mind maps, and getting students to design quizzes to try and test each other about their knowledge of the text. Extensive examples, well, we'll see later, using a grid and thinking across the selection is really important there. In the other video I'm going to be doing for the CATB, I'll be looking at how to approach the superstition and magic selection from a synoptic viewpoint. Well selected. Now, well selected examples that you might set a challenge to your students saying, I pretend you've got to answer a question on this or that. I'd like you to find for me the 10 best examples for this or the 5 best examples for that. And then they need to justify why they've picked them. This is an exercise in selection so that their essays are not just lists. And practicing incorporating them into quotations, rather, into sentences or paragraphs, whether written or indeed verbal. If you're talking about a text in class, you might challenge students to speak almost in paragraphs and include quotations and include translations and then make their point fully out loud orally, which is really good for practice, of course. For AO2, practicing those analysis skills, well, challenging students to always support a point that they make in class with evidence. Challenging them to link between the texts as much as possible. As soon as you started reading a second extract, you can say, is this like the first or unlike the first? Are there any points of comparison or contrast here? Imaginative. This encourages us, I think, to let students take their own, have their own opinion and take their own route in terms of what they want to argue about a question. And so long as it's backed up with references to the text, then actually they're free to interpret it as and how they want. Drawing conclusions. Well, I think encouraging students not to sit on the fence is a really useful strategy. Making debates in class, having votes, and of course, making sure that you're doing the basics of planning an essay carefully, making sure that you do work towards a conclusion, and the boring but useful signpost of linking back to the question at the end of a paragraph. I should, of course, remind you that with the essays, you don't have to be quoting in Latin, but you do need to be referring to bits where in English, so close reference in English rather than knowledge in Latin. And they're not style questions, so style points are not required. I think a good tactic is to set really provocative questions. Here are some I set, for example, for the previous selection of texts. Now, Ovid doesn't succeed. We don't feel sorry for Echo or Narcissus. To what extent do you agree? That sort of quotation or made-up statement is going to potentially invite quite a firm agreement or disagreement. A couple of things to note from the examiner's reports. And I've highlighted in red here a few of the key bits. Some people could not resist developing individual examples for their own sake, neglecting to link to the overarching question. And likewise, some offered no more than a catalogue of items. So there are risks there. Going too much into one example, which is not really that relevant or linked to the question, or listing too many examples in just a list and not really discussing things. In the second paragraph, it does explicitly mention that candidates who have a broader range of material, not just the 4 specified, did really well, so long as, again, they weren't cataloguing. Now, when we say 4, I believe that if you refer to four examples, that can include the picture questions too, the picture sources too. So four different examples, but as a rule of thumb, minimum 4 texts plus then some pictures too. Getting in those visual sources is a really good idea for the essay, and indeed welcomed. This paragraph also talks about some really knowledgeable responses that don't consider different ways in which for example, chariot racing might have been taken seriously. So this is a little nod that a term in the question, a key term, can be or should be thought about in different ways. There are different nuances or interpretations of some of these words, and they can be looked at from X or Y perspective, which will show a really reflective type of student and produce a nuanced essay. And on the right there, I've summarized: include things for a reason, but discuss what you include. Greater range is good so long as it's not a list, and explore key terms in the question in different ways. And that is quite a sophisticated approach, which will certainly be elevating you in terms of AO2, the analysis there. Finally, I'm just going to whiz through some of the key resources that are at your disposal. Fantastic range on the CSCP website, and this screenshot is taken from it. There are the actual text booklets themselves, but then there are translations, there are study booklets, and there are really good notes. The key thing I use every day in class is the student study booklet, which breaks up the text into just a few lines at a time of Latin, and then has running vocab underneath. I'm actually giving every single Latin word, even like, for example, et and ab, which students don't really need, of course, but it is there just to reassure. And then there's plenty of lines for whatever sort of notes you want to do, translation, style, content, grammar, etc. And then a blank facing page. So that's my bread and butter resource. Now, there is also really good for revision, the student kind of text reader, the explorer. This is very similar, to, of course, to the stories in CLC, where students can click on a particular word and bring up the parsing and the vocab. I think good for revision in class, revision independently out of class, sending students these links, making sure they can work through these texts. The CSCP have got a translation nicely presented alongside the Latin there, and also trying to maintain as much as possible the same kind of lineation as the Latin. It also includes some places where they've been a bit more idiomatic in English and given the literal Latin, the literal translation on the right-hand side. For example, in line 5 there, iter institutum, the started journey, which they've translated more fluently as the journey they have begun, so a relative clause. This, of course, is not the official translation. There are various different translations, and of course there's no translation question, and there are different ways to translate Latin perfectly well. So the example don't specify one particular translation to use, but it's a very good starting point. And then there are the notes, which are very extensive, probably too extensive, I think, to give to students. I think students would be quite intimidated by this range of content. And in fact, I would try and incorporate lots of what the notes say in teacher talk, so that in the classroom, as you're reading the text, it is conveyed and students have a chance to write notes down and discuss things, rather than giving them a huge pack of notes initially to work through. The notes, for example, on the Latin are very extensive, sometimes short paragraphs for particular words, which do go way beyond the knowledge required to do really, really well in this exam, but are excellent for teachers to prepare, and then excellent for sometimes some of the really keen students to then go and read up more about the text. But I think my tip would be to read these through yourself first, incorporate them into your teacher talk, make sure you're discussing enough in class and students jotting things down. If you want to do a cut down version of these, great, but I probably wouldn't give the whole lot of them to the class for them to wade through and maybe get a bit lost in. The notes do have really good, though, discussions about the pictures, a page per each, including key information for students, and then a bit more for teachers. And this is a nice way of identifying sort of the core knowledge for each of the pictures. So that could be something that you give to students. And they do have a really good grid of all the different sources, including a sort of summary on the right-hand side of the content, the subject, and the themes. Now, you could remove that column and ask the students to do that themselves as a revision task. You know, what is this picture showing? What is this curse tablet showing, for example? You could add an extra column. How can we link it to a text? Which text in particular does this picture refer to? And then the same sort of thing for the literature itself. Again, you could hide that fourth column, and challenge the students to summarise the content, for example, in their own words. That'd be a really good activity for revision. So they're creating their own grid of this nature. And a nice little note at the bottom, that's always worth stressing. We should bear in mind the authors we're hearing from are male and upper class. So you can think about the voices that we don't have in our selection. So a range of demographic and female voices as well. Finally, there are some other fantastic resources out there made by various people who are very keen and very tech savvy. There are some Quizlet links, for example, which I've just found a couple here. There are translation flashcards, so sentence at a time of the Latin and the English on the reverse, or there are some questions about the actual plot details. For example, which one features a friend named Nasidianus? And that's the sort of thing that students find really accessible and is very good for quick revision at different times of the day or indeed the term. Finally, I've discovered, and if you're watching this, Mr. Windsor, thank you very much, a fantastic set of little videos done by Mr. Windsor, who talks through each selection, each set text, and then highlighting things in different colours to be aware of in terms of content and indeed style. So, to summarise, the Educas selection, I think it approaches text in a broad and quite enlightened way. You've got those visual sources, you've got no need to memorise text and then trot out a translation. You've got essays which require quite a lot of reflection and thought in terms of structure, in terms of a range of picking best examples. And the whole lot is well resourced, really well resourced by CSCP and some fantastic teachers out there who've already done some amazing stuff. So thank you very much. I hope that was useful, and feel free to ask me questions about it on the video panel on the 18th of September. Thanks a lot.